The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 20, Becoming the Guide. What we do with our inner gold. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, a space where we strip away the noise, lean into the raw edges of our humanity, and speak to the truths that don't fit neatly on a vision board. Today we're talking about becoming the guide, not the self-appointed guru with all the answers, but the everyday human who has walked through fire, gathered what they could, and now chooses to share it. We'll explore what we do with the inner gold we've mined from our struggles, and how to offer it in a way that lands without force, without ego, and without losing ourselves in the process. This conversation moves through the subtle art of knowing when to speak and when to listen, the humility to let others find their path, and the deep trust it takes to guide without controlling the outcome. Whether it's in friendships, family, work, or community, we all can be someone else's turning point. The quiet shift from seeker to guide. There's a moment, sometimes so subtle you barely notice it, when your role in the room changes. You're no longer the one asking all the questions. You're the one others look to for the answers. It's not about claiming authority or status. It's about realizing that the lessons you've lived weigh someone else, even if they feel ordinary to you. Recognizing the transition into guidance. Many people think of becoming a guide as a formal role, a mentor, a teacher, or a coach. But in reality, the shift often begins in small, unplanned moments. A friend calls you for advice because you've been through something similar. A colleague asks how you handle stress because they've noticed you carry yourself differently. These micro moments are where lived experience becomes inner gold, wisdom shaped by the friction of real life, not by theory alone. Attributes lived credibility, the trust that comes from having been there. People listen more deeply when they sense you've walked the terrain they're facing. It's not about perfection or flawless outcomes. It's about having real-world proof that you've navigated the same storms and found a way through. Unconscious influence, guiding others without even realizing it. Much of the time, we're modeling behavior or mindset without intending to. The way you pause before reacting, or the calm tone you use in tense situations, can be quietly instructive to others who witness it. Reluctant authority. The hesitancy that comes when others see you as a guide before you see yourself that way. Context. Many people resist the idea of being a teacher because they still feel like a student. But often, those who doubt themselves are the most trustworthy guides, because they are still learning and adapting alongside those they help. The turning point you don't announce. It's rarely a dramatic coronation where someone hands you a title and declares you a guide. It's more often a gradual noticing, a shift in the energy of conversations. You start to see the pattern. People linger after a meeting to pick your brain. Friends text you in the middle of the night because they know you'll listen without judgment. And here's the surprising part. It doesn't always feel flattering. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, even confronting. There's a responsibility that comes with being looked to for guidance, especially when you still feel like you're figuring things out yourself. But that discomfort is a sign you're not approaching it with ego. Being a guide isn't about standing above others. It's about walking beside them with the lantern you've been carrying, sometimes without even realizing it was lit. Personal reflection. I can think of times when I didn't even notice I'd stepped into that role until much later. Once, during a difficult period in my life, I was so focused on keeping myself afloat that I didn't consider how my way of navigating challenges might look from the outside. Months later, a friend told me they'd been quietly watching how I handled things, and that it had changed how they approached their struggles. It was strange to hear because in my mind, I wasn't teaching anything. I was just trying to survive with some dignity intact. Looking back, I realized some of the most meaningful guidance I've ever given wasn't in the form of advice, but in the way I carried myself through something hard. People remember not just what we say, but how we live when life doesn't go as planned. Psychological insight psychologists studying social learning theory, Bandura, 1977, have long shown that we don't just learn through formal instruction. We absorb behaviors, attitudes, and coping mechanisms by observing others. This is called modeling, and it happens constantly in everyday life. Personal example. I once worked alongside someone who handled workplace conflict with such calm, measured responses that it stood out against the usual reactive chaos. I found myself adopting their approach without them ever telling me to. In the same way, we often guide others without a single lesson, simply by demonstrating another way of being. And here's the part we underestimate. Because we live inside our heads, our actions feel ordinary to us, but they can be extraordinary to someone who's never seen that model before. Insight prompt. Think about a time when someone thanked you for helping them, and you were surprised because you hadn't realized you were doing it. What were you modeling in that moment? Theory in action. Start noticing when others lean in, ask for your take, or repeat something you've said. These are subtle signs you're already guiding, whether you've claimed the role or not. Sharing without preaching. The most powerful guidance doesn't feel like a lecture. It slips into conversation like water, finding its way through stone, unforced, natural, and exactly what's needed in the moment. When we share from experience instead of from ego, people lean in instead of shutting down. Theme: the art of offering without overpowering. Guidance can easily tip into control if we mistake sharing for directing. People don't need to be told what to do. They need to be shown what's possible and trusted to choose their way. The most effective guides know when to speak and when to step back, letting the other person's agency lead the way. Attributes empathetic timing, knowing when someone is ready to hear something. Advice given too soon can feel like pressure, but shared at the right moment, it can land as a lifeline. This requires patience and attunement rather than urgency. Experience as story, using lived events to illuminate rather than dictate. Stories disarm defensiveness. When we share what happened to us, rather than prescribing what someone else should do, it leaves space for them to see their path. Respect for autonomy, allowing others the dignity of making their own decisions. Even when we think we know the best course, stepping back communicates trust and avoids creating dependency. Guidance without a pedestal. There's a temptation, once we've figured out something hard, to want to save others from going through it themselves. But much of the learning we value came from wrestling with it in our own time, not being handed the answer. The role of a guide isn't to take someone's journey away from them, but to walk alongside, pointing out the landmarks you've seen without steering the wheel. The truth is, people resist being told, but they remember being shown. A story about the time you made a mistake and learned from it will often do more than a dozen you shoulds. And often, the most transformative moments happen when we're not even trying to make a point, but simply being honest about our process. Personal reflection. I've noticed that when I'm too eager to offer solutions, it's usually because I'm uncomfortable watching someone I care about struggle. But the times I've had the biggest impact weren't when I rushed in, they were when I shared a piece of my journey and then let it go. Once, a friend was deciding whether to leave a job that was slowly draining them. Instead of telling them what I thought they should do, I told them about the time I stayed too long in a situation that was eroding my confidence. I shared the signs I ignored and how that choice affected me long after. I didn't push them toward a decision, but weeks later, they told me that the story helped them see their warning signs more clearly. Psychological insight research in narrative psychology shows that we're wired to respond to stories because they allow us to place ourselves inside the experience without feeling dictated to. This approach taps into self-referential processing, the brain's tendency to evaluate new information concerning our own lives. Personal example. I once received advice phrased as a direct instruction or a demand, and my immediate reaction was to push back, which is also a known phenomenon, pathological demand avoidance, even though it was good advice. But when someone later shared their own, similar situation without telling me what to do, I naturally connected the dots myself. The autonomy made all the difference in whether I acted on it. Guides who use this approach don't just transfer knowledge, they foster independent thinking. Insight prompt. Recall a time someone's story shifted your perspective without them ever telling you what choice to make. How did their approach change how you received the message? Theory in action. The next time you're tempted to give advice, pause and reframe it as a personal story instead. Notice how the other person responds differently when they feel invited into the insight rather than pushed toward it. Guiding through imperfection. One of the biggest misconceptions about becoming a guide is that you need to have everything figured out first. In truth, the moments where your imperfections show can be the most valuable for others. They prove that wisdom doesn't require perfection, it requires honesty. Theme: leading without the illusion of flawlessness. The pressure to have it all together can stop people from stepping into the role of guide. But authenticity builds trust far faster than the performance of perfection ever could. When you show that you're still learning, you make it safer for others to do the same. Attributes vulnerability as connection, letting others see your humanity. Admitting mistakes or doubts doesn't weaken your credibility. It makes your guidance more relatable. Adaptive wisdom, allowing your approach to evolve rather than clinging to a fixed formula. What worked for you in one chapter might not work in another, and sharing that flexibility helps others adapt too. Modeling resilience, showing that setbacks aren't the end, but part of the process. People learn as much from how you recover as from how you succeed. The power of being seen in progress. Think about the difference between hearing advice from someone who claims they never struggle and hearing it from someone who admits they still have hard days. Which feels more believable? Which feels more like permission to be human? Guidance born from lived experience is richer when it includes the rough edges. Perfection creates distance. Imperfection invites closeness. When we share the whole picture, the wins and the stumbles, we offer something far more valuable than an image to aspire to. We offer a reality that can be inhabited. Personal reflection. I've learned that some of the most powerful connections I've made came from admitting I didn't have all the answers. I can remember a conversation where I was trying to help someone through a tough decision, and instead of offering a neatly packaged solution, I told them about my uncertainty in a similar situation. I could see the shift in their posture. They relaxed. They no longer felt like they were failing for not having it all figured out. That's when I realized that what they needed wasn't my certainty, but my companionship in uncertainty. Psychological Insight Brené Brown's research on vulnerability and leadership highlights that people trust those who are willing to show their imperfections. This ties into relational authenticity, a concept in social psychology that emphasizes congruence between our internal experience and external expression. Personal example. Early in my working life, I thought credibility meant never admitting when I was unsure. But when I started being more transparent about the things I was still learning, I noticed my relationships, both personal and professional, deepened. People no longer saw me as unreachable, they saw me as real. Guides who own their imperfections model a more sustainable kind of growth, one that embraces the process instead of obsessing over the image. Insight prompt. When was the last time you connected more deeply with someone because they admitted they didn't have all the answers? How did that change the way you felt about your challenges? Theory in action. The next time you feel pressure to present yourself as flawless, try sharing one thing you're still figuring out. Watch how it shifts the energy of the conversation and invites others to open up too. Listening as leadership true guidance isn't just about speaking. It's about listening in a way that makes others feel truly heard. The best guides know that the answers don't always come from them. Often, they come from the person they're guiding, if given the space to emerge. Theme: the quiet power of deep listening. In a culture that rewards quick opinions and constant output, listening can be a radical act. It shifts the focus from delivering instant advice to creating the space where someone else can process, reflect, and arrive at their truth. Attributes presence over prescription, holding space without rushing to solve. People often know more than they realize. A guide's job isn't to overwrite that wisdom, but to help it surface. Empathic attention, listening beyond words to tone, pace, and silence. What someone doesn't say can reveal as much as what they do. Reflective feedback, mirroring back what you've heard to help them clarify. This not only validates their experience, but also deepens their self-awareness. The guide who listens first think of the conversations where you left feeling lighter, not because someone gave you the perfect solution, but because they made you feel understood. That's the heart of guiding. Not rushing to fill the space with your own stories or advice, but being willing to sit in the quiet and let their truth unfold. When you listen fully, without rehearsing your next sentence in your head, you send the message that their words matter. In a world that's constantly speaking over itself, that kind of attention is rare and deeply transformative. Personal reflection. I've had moments where I was so eager to help that I jumped in too soon with advice. I remember one conversation with a friend who was navigating a major life change. I thought I was being helpful by pointing out possible solutions, but I could see their energy retreat. Later, I asked what would have been more useful, and they said, I just needed someone to hear me out first. Since then, I've made a conscious effort to slow down, to listen without the urgency of fixing. Ironically, I've found that people often find their answers faster when I stop trying to give them mine. Psychological insight Carl Rogers' work in person-centered therapy emphasizes unconditional positive regard, the practice of accepting and valuing a person without judgment, which creates a safe environment for them to explore their thoughts. Personal example. I once worked alongside someone who modeled this so effortlessly that people sought them out just to talk. They didn't offer much advice, but when they reflected on what they'd heard, it often sounded like wisdom, because it was the person's wisdom, reframed and validated. Guides who master listening understand that they're not there to write someone else's story, but to hand them the pen. Insight prompt. When was the last time someone truly listened to you without interrupting or steering the conversation? How did that change what you shared? Theory in action. In your next conversation, set yourself the challenge of asking 3 follow-up questions before offering any advice. See what surfaces when you give someone space to find their answers. Sharing without overshadowing a true guide knows when to step into the light and when to step back. Sharing your story can inspire, but if you take up too much space, you risk turning the moment into your performance instead of supporting the other person's growth. Theme. Balancing self-expression with space for others' guidance works best when it's rooted in lived experience, but it's easy to forget that the purpose of sharing is to serve the listener, not to center yourself. Attribute story as a bridge, offering personal experience to create connection, not comparison. When used well, your story becomes a pathway for someone else to see what's possible for them. Selective vulnerability. Choosing details that serve the moment, not just your need to be heard. Oversharing can overwhelm or shift the focus away from the person you're guiding. Purposeful parallels, aligning your story with their needs. This helps them see relevance without feeling like you're making it about you. Knowing when your story serves the story, there's a fine art to knowing when to share and when to hold back. Imagine a mentor who turns every question into an autobiography. It becomes less about helping and more about broadcasting. Contrast that with a guide who shares just enough to open a door and then steps aside so you can walk through it. Stories can be powerful mirrors, but only when they reflect the listener's potential instead of spotlighting the teller's achievements. Personal reflection, I've been on both ends of this. I've had conversations where someone's advice was so packed with their own experiences that I felt like there was no room left for mine. And I've caught myself doing it too, thinking that if I explained every detail of how I navigated something, it would somehow transfer the lesson. But I've learned that the most powerful guidance comes in fragments. A single sentence, a brief example, or even a quiet acknowledgement can sometimes land deeper than an entire backstory. These moments feel less like lectures and more like invitations. Psychological insight. From a communication perspective, social penetration theory reminds us that intimacy grows in layers. Too much too soon, even with good intentions, can push people away. Similarly, the self-reference effect in cognitive psychology explains why people remember information better when it's connected to their own experience, and not just the speaker's. Personal example. In a conversation with someone struggling through burnout, I shared just one detail from my recovery, that I stopped measuring my worth by productivity. It wasn't a long story, but it became the turning point for them to reconsider their patterns. Insight prompt. When you share your own story, How do you decide how much is enough? Theory in action. Before telling your story, pause and ask yourself, will this help them see their path more clearly, or am I just filling the silence? Passing the torch. The real measure of guidance isn't how much people remember about you, it's how much they remember about themselves after you've gone. Passing the torch means making yourself unnecessary in the best possible way. Theme. Empowering others to continue without you. True guidance doesn't create dependence. It equips people to navigate without constant reassurance, building resilience that lasts beyond your presence. Attribute skill transfer, offering tools, not just answers. A good guide teaches others how to think through problems, rather than just giving ready-made solutions. Encouraged autonomy, supporting independent decision-making. When people feel capable of acting on their own, they are more likely to apply what they've learned in varied situations. Lasting confidence, focusing on belief in self, not belief in you. If the relationship relies on your ongoing approval, the growth is fragile and easily undone. Building something that outlives the moment. Passing the torch isn't about letting go of responsibility. It's about trusting the other person to hold what you've given them. Think of it like teaching someone to light their fire. You don't keep returning to stoke it for them. You trust that they know how to keep it burning. This doesn't mean abandoning them. It means shifting from a primary role to a supportive presence, or even stepping fully back once the foundation is strong. The point is to give them ownership over their growth, so they don't have to keep returning to your well for water. Personal reflection, I've noticed that some of the most rewarding guidance I've given has ended in silence, not because the relationship faded, but because they didn't need me anymore. I've watched friends, colleagues, and even people I've casually supported take an idea or tool and run with it far beyond what I could have done myself. There's pride in that, but also a quiet humility. It's a reminder that the work isn't about being the hero of their story. It's about making sure they have everything they need to be their own. Psychological insight. The concept of self-efficacy, introduced by psychologist Albert Bandura, is central here. When people believe they can succeed through their efforts, they are more persistent, adaptable, and resilient. Over-reliance on external guidance can weaken this belief. Personal example. I once supported someone through a career transition. At first, they came to me for every step in regards to preparing their application for professional engineering registration, guidance on the accreditation specification and framework, to rehearsing conversations for accreditation interviews. Eventually, I stopped giving them exact scripts and instead asked, "What do you think you should do here?" The shift was immediate. Within weeks, they weren't asking for my input anymore, and months later, they told me they'd handled the ending process entirely on their own. Insight prompt. Think about a time you guided someone. Did you leave them with tools they could still use without you? Theory in action. Next time you offer advice, try framing it as a question. How might you approach this? This invites them to think for themselves while still feeling supported. The ripple you'll never see. Not every impact you have will circle back to you. Some will flow into lives you'll never meet, in moments you'll never witness. Theme: legacy without recognition. The most powerful influence often happens quietly, without applause or even acknowledgement. It's the changes people make because of something you said, did, or modeled. Changes that keep moving long after you've stepped away. Attributes unseen influence. Actions shaping outcomes beyond your awareness. You may never know how your words land, but they can still live in someone's decisions years later. Attachment from credit. Finding satisfaction without validation. Letting go of recognition allows you to guide with purity of intent, not performance for praise. Sustained impact. Contributions that embed into someone's personal growth. The work becomes part of them, influencing choices and perspectives far beyond your direct involvement. Letting the current carry it. When you drop a stone into water, you don't get to follow every ripple. You trust they're moving outward, touching shores you'll never see. Guidance works the same way. You plant seeds that may take years to grow, and you might never know they blossomed. This requires releasing the urge to measure your worth by visible results. Your influence is not diminished just because it's invisible to you. The deepest transformations are often the quietest. Personal reflection. I can think of moments where something small someone said changed my life in ways they'll never know. It's humbling to realize I've likely done the same for others, even when I assumed our interaction was ordinary. There's a kind of peace in that. It reminds me that my role isn't to track my impact like a scoreboard, but to live in a way where anything I share could be the thing that makes a difference. Whether I ever find out doesn't matter. Psychological insight psychologists studying prosocial behavior note that much of our helping behavior has delayed or indirect effects. Research by Fowler and Christakis, 2008, on social networks found that kindness and generosity can spread through 3 degrees of separation, meaning an act of guidance or support can influence people you've never met. Personal example. Years ago, I shared a resource with a colleague who mentioned it in passing to a friend. That friend ended up using it as part of their project. I only heard about it years later. I had no involvement beyond the first conversation, but the ripple still happened. Insight prompt. Can you think of a way you've been shaped by someone who will never know they shaped you? Theory in action. The next time you offer help or guidance, resist the urge to check on how it went. Trust the ripple to move without your oversight. Carrying the gold forward guidance isn't about shining a light so bright that it blinds the other person. It's about holding a lantern just far enough ahead for them to see their next step. What you've lived, endured, and learned is part of your unique fingerprint on the world. When you share from a place of groundedness rather than performance, you give people something real to lean on. And when you let go of whether they follow your advice, you free both of you from the weight of expectation. So carry your inner gold forward, not as a crown to be admired, but as currency to invest in moments that matter. Trust that even if you never see the ripple, it's still moving. And when someone thanks you years from now for something you barely remember, you'll know. The guide you became made a difference you couldn't have planned. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and keep passing the light on. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse, a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction, Journeys Through Persuasion, Propaganda, and the Unseen Forces of the Mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The alchemy within traces, food, frequency, and the forgotten intelligence of the body. Episode 20. Encoded flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.